August 17, 1943. Two columns of dust rose above the Sicilian hills, racing toward the same destination. In one jeep, an American general sat rigid with anticipation, pushing his driver harder. On a parallel road, a British commander urged his convoy forward through exhaustion and heat. The port of Messina lay ahead, not just a military objective, but a trophy neither man would surrender to the other. They were allies. They wore different uniforms but served the same cause. Yet on this morning, they were competitors in a contest that would define both their legacies. Whoever entered Messina first would claim victory not just over the Germans, but over each other. Whoever arrived second would carry that defeat for the rest of their lives. This wasn't just about capturing a port. This was personal. To understand how two Allied generals came to race each other through Sicily, you have to go back to the darkest days of Britain's war. For nearly 3 years, British forces had suffered one catastrophe after another. Dunkirk, Greece, Singapore, Tobruk. Every theater brought another retreat, another surrender, another evacuation. The British army seemed cursed, incapable of winning a single major land battle against German forces. Then came October 1942, and everything changed. At a desolate railway station called El Alamein in the Egyptian desert, a new British commander prepared to make his stand. His name was Bernard Montgomery. He was methodical, cautious, and absolutely determined to erase 3 years of humiliation. At El Alamein, Montgomery faced Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. For 12 days and nights, British and Commonwealth forces hammered German and Italian positions. It was brutal, grinding, exhausting, but it worked. The Axis line broke. Rommel retreated. For the first time in the entire war, Britain had won a major land victory. The impact was seismic. Church bells rang across England. Newspapers declared Montgomery the savior of the nation. Winston Churchill called it the end of the beginning. Overnight, Bernard Montgomery became more than a general. He became a symbol, the man who'd finally proven that British arms could defeat the Wehrmacht. Montgomery understood the power of that moment, and he cultivated it deliberately. He wore a distinctive black beret with 2 badges, one British, one Australian. He issued personal messages to his troops, speaking directly to ordinary soldiers in language they understood. He built relationships with friendly journalists who portrayed him as a flawless military genius. In the British press, Montgomery wasn't just a commander, he was the commander, Britain's greatest soldier since Wellington. He believed his own mythology. And for a while, so did almost everyone else. Across the Atlantic, another general faced a very different problem. His name was George Smith Patton, and while Montgomery basked in global fame, Patton was cleaning up someone else's disaster in near anonymity. In February 1943, inexperienced American forces had been mauled at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. German panzer units tore through unprepared American divisions, killing or capturing thousands. It was a humiliating introduction to European warfare for the U.S. Army. Newspapers questioned whether Americans could fight at all. German propagandists mocked them as soft, undisciplined amateurs. Patton was brought in to fix the mess. He took command of the battered 2nd Corps and within days transformed it through relentless, almost brutal discipline. Soldiers who'd been sloppy suddenly found themselves drilling at dawn, boots polished, uniforms immaculate, helmets strapped. Officers who tolerated mediocrity were replaced. Standards that had slipped under fire were restored with iron resolve. It wasn't popular, but it worked. Units that had broken and run at Kasserine learned to stand and fight. Within weeks, American formations were counterattacking with competence and growing confidence. By the end of the North African campaign, the 2nd Corps was a professional fighting force. But when the headlines were written, most of the credit went to Montgomery and the British 8th Army. In British and American newspapers alike, Montgomery was the hero who'd saved North Africa. The Americans were portrayed as junior partners who'd finally learned how to fight, under British tutelage. Patton seethed in silence. He'd rebuilt a shattered corps while Montgomery took bows in the spotlight. But George Patton had a long memory. He didn't forget slights. Sicily was supposed to be different. Operation Husky would be the first major Allied invasion of Axis-held Europe, and the original plan gave both armies significant roles. Patton's American 7th Army would land on the western and southern coasts, driving toward Palermo. Montgomery's British 8th Army would land in the east and push north along the coast road toward Messina. Two parallel advances. Two commanders. Shared glory. Montgomery rejected it almost immediately. In his view, the main blow had to come from his 8th Army, the proven force that had defeated Rommel. The Americans, in his estimation, were still learning. They should protect his flanks, guard supply lines, and leave the decisive objectives to the professionals. He pushed this argument up the chain of command, bypassing American officers and appealing directly to Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander. Eisenhower, desperate to maintain the fragile Anglo-American alliance and keenly aware of Montgomery's political weight in London, yielded. The plan was rewritten. Montgomery would carry the main offensive. Patton's 7th Army would shield his exposed left flank. When Patton learned of the change, he erupted in private fury. Montgomery had stolen the campaign before the first landing craft hit the beach. Publicly, Patton saluted and obeyed. But privately, he told his staff to watch for any opportunity to do more than guard flanks. If that chance came, he'd take it. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Sicily. Montgomery's 8th Army landed in the east and began pushing north as planned. Almost immediately, they ran into a wall. German forces had fortified the approaches to Catania, turning the coastal highway into a death trap. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Minefields channeled attackers into killing zones. Artillery pounded any unit that tried to advance. Day after day, Montgomery launched attacks. Day after day, his troops were thrown back with heavy casualties. The road to Messina, which had looked like a straight path on the planning maps, turned into a grinding, bloody stalemate. The offensive that was supposed to race up the coast had stalled within sight of its first major objective. Montgomery blamed the terrain. He blamed German defensive skill. He blamed insufficient artillery support and the heat and the rugged Sicilian landscape. What he didn't do was admit that his strategy had failed. Meanwhile, Patton sat on Montgomery's flank with far more combat power than was needed to simply guard it. He had an entire army, divisions of infantry, armor, and artillery, watching while the main battle ground to a halt. For a man like George Patton, this was intolerable. He went to General Harold Alexander, the British officer commanding the entire Sicily operation, with a bold proposal. Instead of sitting idle, why not strike west across the mountains and capture Palermo? It wasn't part of the plan, but the plan clearly wasn't working. Alexander, recognizing that something had to break the stalemate, reluctantly agreed. Patton had his green light. What happened next stunned everyone. In 72 hours, Patton's forces stormed across more than 100 miles of brutal mountain roads. They seized town after town, overwhelming surprised German and Italian rearguard units. On July 22, American troops entered Palermo, capturing thousands of prisoners and massive stocks of supplies. It was exactly the kind of fast, aggressive operation Montgomery's 8th Army had failed to execute. And the world noticed. Newspapers across America and Britain exploded with headlines praising Patton's lightning offensive. For the first time in the war, an American general was front-page news, not for losing, but for winning in spectacular fashion. Patton had deliberately seized the spotlight, and it had worked. Montgomery was furious. He fired off messages to Alexander complaining that Palermo was strategically irrelevant, that Patton was grandstanding, that the real objective was still Messina. But everyone could see the truth. The American army wasn't a junior partner anymore. And Montgomery's reputation for invincibility had cracked. With Palermo secured, Patton pivoted east. Now both armies were racing toward Messina from different directions, and the competition everyone had tried to avoid was fully in the open. Montgomery drove his exhausted troops harder, launching small amphibious landings to bypass German strong points. He tried flanking maneuvers and repeated frontal assaults. Progress was agonizingly slow and costly. Patton drove his men with equal ruthlessness, but he moved faster. He ordered amphibious leapfrog operations, landing troops behind German positions and forcing the enemy to abandon carefully prepared defenses or risk encirclement. His units advanced along the northern coastal road, accepting casualties that more cautious commanders might have avoided. The rivalry had become dangerous. Both men were taking risks not because military necessity demanded it, but because neither could stomach letting the other win. Pride had become a military objective. And soldiers were paying the price. Somewhere in the telling of stories like this, we have to pause and acknowledge the cost beneath the drama. Thousands of young men, American, British, Canadian, marched through Sicilian heat, fought through German positions, and died on those dusty roads while their generals competed for glory. Their names aren't in the headlines. But they paid the full price of this rivalry. On the morning of August 17, Patton's 3rd Infantry Division rolled into Messina. When the first British patrols arrived hours later, they found American soldiers already controlling the port. American flags already hung from buildings overlooking the harbor. Patton staged a deliberately theatrical welcome, greeting British officers with exaggerated warmth. "Congratulations on a splendid effort," he told them, making absolutely certain they understood he'd beaten them there. Montgomery didn't come. He couldn't face the moment. He sent subordinates to shake Patton's hand while he nursed his humiliation miles away. For Patton, it was the greatest triumph of his career. For Montgomery, it was a wound that would never fully heal. But Patton's victory came with a hidden cost he didn't yet see. During the Sicily campaign, in 2 separate field hospitals, Patton had slapped soldiers suffering from what we'd now call combat stress. He'd accused them of cowardice, struck them, and humiliated them in front of medical staff and wounded comrades. To Patton, raised on a harsh warrior code, fear in battle was something to be beaten out of a man. To the rest of the world, it was unforgivable. When the story broke, the American press erupted. Editorials demanded Patton's dismissal. Members of Congress called for court-martial. Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologize, privately to the soldiers, publicly to every division in his army. The apologies were humiliating, but they saved Patton's career. They also gave Eisenhower a reason to sideline him. Montgomery, still bitter over Messina, told anyone who would listen that Patton was undisciplined, reckless, and temperamentally unfit for high command. The slapping incident seemed to prove his point. When planning began for the invasion of France, Montgomery was given overall command of ground forces for D-Day, June 6, 1944. It was one of the most prestigious assignments of the entire war. Patton, meanwhile, sat in England commanding a fictitious army, a ghost force designed to fool German intelligence. The most aggressive field commander in the Allied arsenal had been reduced to a decoy while others fought the war's most important battle. Montgomery had promised that Cannes, a key city just inland from the invasion beaches, would fall on the first day. In reality, the battle for Cannes dragged on for over a month. He launched massive offensives, Operation Goodwood, Operation Epsom, that bled his divisions badly while gaining only narrow corridors of territory. The British sector became a slow, grinding meat grinder. Montgomery blamed the bocage terrain, the weather, the tenacity of German panzer divisions. He hinted that the Americans weren't being aggressive enough in their sector. What he didn't admit was that his cautious, methodical style was poorly suited to the rapid breakout Normandy demanded. On August 1, 1944, Patton finally stepped back into the war. His Third Army became operational and was given a straightforward mission: exploit the American breakout near St. Lo. What followed was one of the most stunning campaigns in modern military history. Patton's armored columns lunged into open country, driving 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles a day. They bypassed German strong points, seized bridges before the enemy could destroy them, and overran supply depots. Whole towns surrendered to forward scouts. In roughly 2 weeks, Patton's Third Army advanced farther than Montgomery's forces had managed in 2 brutal months. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Montgomery was still fighting for hedgerows and suburbs, Patton was racing toward the German border. Newspapers filled with dramatic photos of Sherman tanks rolling through liberated French towns. Once again, the spotlight shifted to the American general. And once again, Montgomery complained bitterly, this time that Patton was being favored with fuel and supplies while the British sector was neglected. As Allied armies approached Germany's borders, a fierce argument erupted at the highest levels of command. Montgomery insisted the time had come for a single, concentrated thrust into Germany under his leadership. Concentrate all available supplies on his forces, he argued, and he'd drive straight to Berlin, ending the war in one bold stroke. Patton had a very different vision. He believed the German armies were collapsing and that his Third Army, if properly supplied, could punch through the Rhine and into the German heartland before Montgomery's slow buildup was even ready. He favored a broad front strategy, multiple armies advancing simultaneously, giving the Germans no time to regroup. Eisenhower, trapped between 2 strong-willed commanders with powerful political backers, chose a compromise. He officially adopted the broad front approach, but granted Montgomery priority for one special operation designed to leapfrog the Rhine defenses and open a direct route into northern Germany. That operation was called Market Garden. On September 17, 1944, the largest airborne operation in history began. Thousands of British and American paratroopers dropped into the Netherlands to seize a series of bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Montgomery's ground forces would race up a single highway, one narrow road, linking up with each airborne pocket in turn, crossing the final river barrier at Arnhem, and driving into Germany. It was audacious. It was also extremely fragile. Everything had to go exactly right. Almost nothing did. German resistance was far stronger than intelligence had predicted. The single highway became a death trap, constantly cut by counterattacks. At Arnhem, the famous "Bridge Too Far," British paratroopers held out for 9 days against overwhelming odds, waiting for relief that never came. Of the 10,000 men who dropped near Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Market Garden failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. It consumed enormous quantities of fuel and ammunition. And it cost over 7,000 Allied casualties. Montgomery, unwilling to admit the plan had been flawed, declared the operation 90% successful. Almost everyone else, from frontline soldiers to Allied headquarters staff, understood it had been a costly failure. Patton, whose own advance had been halted because supplies were diverted to support Market Garden, felt bitterly vindicated. He'd warned that concentrating resources on Montgomery's narrow thrust was dangerous. Now his tank sat idle for lack of gasoline while battered survivors limped back from Arnhem. Then came December 16, 1944. Under cover of fog and snow, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. American units holding what had been considered a quiet sector were smashed and driven back in chaos. Within days, the front line bulged westward on Allied maps, the Battle of the Bulge. Eisenhower acted quickly. He placed American forces north of the Bulge under Montgomery's temporary command. And he ordered Patton to do something that seemed impossible, turn his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and drive north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, where units like the 101st Airborne were surrounded and under constant attack. At a tense conference, Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly he could pivot his forces and strike north. Patton answered immediately, 48 hours. The room erupted in disbelief. Turning 3 full divisions across their own supply lines, through ice and snow, into enemy positions, in 2 days. It was logistically impossible. Except it wasn't. Patton had already started planning for exactly this contingency. In less than 48 hours, he wheeled the Third Army northward. Supply convoys reversed course. Maps were redrawn overnight. Artillery units abandoned positions and displaced north. Infantry divisions marching east suddenly turned 90 degrees through frozen fields. And within 2 days, Patton's forces were smashing into the German flank. It was a feat that stunned even hardened staff officers. No other commander in the Allied camp could have pulled it off. While Montgomery was still organizing counterattacks in the northern sector, Patton's men were already breaking through to Bastogne and beginning the brutal work of crushing the German salient. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference that nearly destroyed the Allied alliance. Standing before reporters, he described how he'd taken command in the north when the Americans were reeling. How his calm leadership and sound planning had saved the situation. He spoke of British steadiness under pressure. He mentioned Patton only in passing. He barely acknowledged the American units that had held Bastogne, frozen and outnumbered, for 9 critical days. He left the clear impression that the British Army, under his personal leadership, had rescued the Americans from their own bungling. The reaction in the United States was explosive. Newspapers that had once praised Montgomery turned on him with fury. Patton was livid. Omar Bradley, normally the picture of measured professionalism, threatened to resign if Montgomery were ever given command over American forces again. Eisenhower had to intervene personally, issuing public statements emphasizing American contributions and quietly pressuring Montgomery to back away from his claims. The press conference revealed something many had suspected: for Montgomery, reputation mattered more than reality. He cared more about credit than accuracy. The last act of the rivalry played out along the Rhine River. Eisenhower's plan called for Montgomery to make the main crossing, a massive, carefully prepared assault with overwhelming force. Montgomery spent weeks assembling troops, artillery, engineering equipment, and air support for a textbook operation. Then, on March 7, fate intervened. Soldiers from the American 9th Armored Division discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. The Germans had tried and failed to destroy it. Without hesitation, American forces rushed across and established a bridgehead on the eastern bank. Patton watched events at Remagen with admiration, and a hint of jealousy. He wanted his own dramatic crossing. On March 22, he mounted a hasty assault across the Rhine in his sector, using improvised boats and catching the Germans off guard. When his forces made it across, Patton telephoned Bradley with a request: keep it quiet for a few hours so he could get more troops over before Montgomery's grand operation overshadowed it. The next night, Montgomery launched his massive Rhine crossing. It involved airborne drops, naval support craft, and a blizzard of artillery fire. It was an impressive display of military power. But with Remagen already secured and Patton having slipped across the previous day, the comparison was unavoidable. Montgomery had needed an army group, weeks of preparation, and a carefully orchestrated spectacle to accomplish what Patton had done almost on the fly. The Patton-Montgomery rivalry had real consequences. Resources were sometimes divided to appease egos rather than allocated to whoever could use them most effectively. Operations were launched not solely